most of human history, when people were rich, it was usually as a result of them being the most powerful, the most brutal people, yeah, right? And like these people ended up like becoming like the kings and generals and aristocrats, etc., etc. And the way they got wealth was by taking wealth from other people. Capitalism is the first time where you have an economic system in which people can become wealthy not by taking things from others, but by providing goods and services to people that they want, but charged at a higher price than the actual cost of production was, right? So in that way, I sell you something that you want, and and you get something that I've sold you, and in return, you're going to give me a little bit more money than it actually cost me to do it. So I'm now incentivized to keep making you things, and you don't mind paying the extra bit of money because you're valuing the thing you get in return. So as a result of this, people are starting to get more and more wealthy. And this leads on to what was also happening at that time, which is the age of discovery. Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas, and so all the other European powers start to go to the Americas, start setting up the trading post, start trying to conquer new territory, start importing slaves. And while you had all of this system, you still had the overarching view of economics, which was this: the world has a finite amount of wealth, and the only way that our country can become richer is by taking land, taking money from others. And so this, in the context of the age of discovery, meant that the logical conclusion was something called mercantilism. Mercantilism was basically the different European powers going, right, we need to take the wealth from here, we need to do this, we need to take that, etc., etc. And this led to lots of wars throughout the colonies and throughout Europe, as different nation states competed for different trade routes and different access to spices, access to cotton, access to sugar, etc. Throughout the 16th to the 18th century, Europe and the world as a whole was it was ripped apart by multiple different conflicts to do with this idea of we need to get money, otherwise they'll get money, and then we're going to be poor as a result of this. But is this necessarily true? Is it true that there's a finite amount of money in the world and that it's all about winner takes all kind of thing in terms of I need to take more from you in order to be richer? Not necessarily. And this is where we start to see the counter to this mindset arise from England, right? Or Britain more generally. Britain during this time, it started having colonies, it started having empires, it started having imperial dominions in the Caribbean, in the Americas as well. And through the British East India Trading Company, that's basically a private company which is authorised by the Crown. And out in India, they took vast swathes of land, they had private armies, it was one of the most profitable companies in the world, right? And the Dutch also had one as well. It's something like the largest company that's ever existed or something in terms of wealth, right? It was huge. But the thing is, what we have to think of is, were colonies necessarily beneficial to the home nation? Not really. If you look at the actual stats on it, what you'll tend to find is that the countries themselves, the populations themselves bore a huge tax burden in terms of having a navy, setting up infrastructure, etc., etc. But actually, the costs were distributed amongst the population. But the benefits of imperialism went to the tiny planter elite, the tiny the tiny merchant elite who benefited from that, right? So they're the ones who are the slave owners, they're the ones who are the profit seekers out in India, etc., etc. By and large, colonialism, imperialism served the interest of the few and not the many. Never mind the actual natives and stuff, all the slaves who were the victims of it. Clearly, wealth is not being created here. Yeah, all that's happening is that the public are paying for the cost of making people who are already incredibly rich even richer. Right? The nation as a whole is not necessarily becoming richer from this, and the money that the rich people are getting, they're just spending on lavish country homes, etc., etc. So how is it that Britain ends up becoming the richest country on earth? Part of it comes down to this, right? In the late 18th century, you had people like David Hume, like Adam Smith, right, both Scottish economists. And what they began to realize is actually this idea of finite wealth is actually not true. That actually through industrialization, through the division of labor, through entrepreneurialism, and through interest and profit seeking, etc., actually the size of the pie can actually expand rather than just always being the same. The way to think about it is if we're all children and we're all waiting at the dinner table and there's a bit of pizza and we all go, oh right, okay, there's only this much pizza, yeah, so if I want more pizza, that means I take more slices from you. If, however, that pizza is always expanding, then it doesn't matter if I only take a little bit, because I'm still going to be fine and you're going to be fine. And this is actually how the economy genuinely works. As a result of this, people in Britain started to realise actually the best way for us to get money, and for us to become very wealthy, is actually through trading, right? So this is where the City of London had a great advantage. So in medieval Europe, you had the feudal system, which kept peasants tied to their land, yeah, through a system known as serfdom, right? And is a thing of, you'd end up working for your lord, yeah, and that would be it really. But the people who decided to flee from that and wanted to be free men, all they had to do was go to the cities, yeah, and in particular cities like London, which, as we said in a previous video, they had their own separate laws and stuff here, which were agreed all the way back in 1066, right, saying that actually the City of London operates under different rules from the rest of the country. So if you were a business person, the City of London was the place to go. All the goods, from around the world, all the spices, all the sugar, all the cotton, all the coffee, etc., came through and went into London and went to the rest of the country and the rest of Europe. And so the merchants who were there, the traders who were there, yes, they end up benefiting from the profits that came as a byproduct of imperialism, but the real wealth was made in those exchanges, yeah, was made in the profit-seeking nature of the London Stock Exchange. Because if one compares why Britain became wealthy as opposed to why Spain and Portugal did not become wealthy, Spain and Portugal had empires for longer. They had, at that time, bigger colonies than Britain did. They had far more slaves, far more slaves went to places like Brazil. They never went to the Caribbean or to the Americas. And yet, Britain ended up becoming incredibly rich, while Spain and Portugal remain relatively poor in comparison. And that's because, unlike the Spanish and the Portuguese, who just wasted a lot of their money and end up being victims of silver inflation, etc., the British and the Dutch in particular ended up becoming entrepreneurial. They end up adopting a capitalist mindset. And this is how, rather than squandering the wealth that came as a byproduct of imperialism and of colonization, it was a thing of actually they started setting up institutions which actually made the most of the wealth of the nation and of the world. This is when you start to see an explosion of wealth in these countries, and the rest of the world becoming remarkably falling behind. So this now leads on to the thing with regard to what's the argument for colonization. So pretty much most of the colonies which were gained after this time, most of the reasons why people were in favour of so-called new imperialism in the 19th century was mainly to do with the fact that they wanted prestige, they wanted national prestige. This was now the era of nationalism, and people wanted their country to have the biggest empire, to paint the most places on the map like pink or blue or whatever, right? And so it stopped kind of being really about what made economic sense, and it started to be more a thing of what makes our country look mightier on the world stage. But if you think about imperialism in practical sense, you're going to have to pay for a navy to patrol the waters there. You have to pay an army to defend that land. You're then also going to have the army on standby in case there's any rebellions from the natives. And you're going to have to build the roads. You're going to have to build the ports. You're going to have to all these kind of things, right? And then you're going to have to build the mines. And so that takes a lot of upfront investment. And as I said before, it benefits a handful of people who are in control of that process. As a result, most places in, like most colonies, for instance, with the exception of South Africa and a handful of others, did not actually have a net profit. The Caribbean, which was, produced lots of the sugar and lots of the coffee, etc., actually the cost of maintaining those colonies for the Royal Navy and setting up ports and all that stuff, it was far outweighed any kind of benefit that the Treasury got from it. And you see this again within Africa. You see, with the exception of the Belgian Congo and South Africa, no other colony in the whole of Africa was a net profit for the colonizers, especially as time goes on and the technology gap closes. When Europeans first went in, they had guns, they had medicine, they had they had far better technology than many of the natives that they were subduing. However, by the time it gets to World War One, World War Two, so even before the official period of decolonization, you start to see that actually the cost of maintaining all these things is going up because the natives are now able to get rifles and you've got rifles. So now they're doing guerrilla campaigns, they're doing sabotage campaigns, they're doing sit-ins, they're doing protests, etc. And the cost of your colonies, the cost of maintaining your colonies go up and up and up. The colonial powers cling onto their empires far beyond the point at which it made economic sense. Because of pride, because of national prestige, even by the end of World War One, it becomes clear that that colonization is becoming unfashionable. This is why, for instance, if you compare the reaction to the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1896, and you compare it to the conquest of it in 1935, again by the Italians, the reaction is completely different. Because in the late 19th century, the different colonial powers are going, yes, we want to take this colony and take that colony and smash those natives and blah, blah, blah. By the time it gets to the 1920s, 1930s, it becomes a laughable. It becomes like, what are you doing? It ends up being a thing where people are really disgusted now at imperialism. They've become really put off by it. And this helped, the technology from the press, etc. It kind of, all pictures, radio, all these kind of things start to really paint a picture of what it's actually like, as opposed to what people have romanticized it as being. In economic senses, it didn't make sense to have these colonies for as long as they did. However, one thing that colonization did do was allow more access to more resources throughout the world in places which it would have been relatively difficult, though not impossible, for people to have traded with anyway. It meant that people could set up rubber plantations, they could set up gold mines, etc., without the fear of people coming to invade it and taking it all from them. It was only because of the British Empire, through this kind of capitalist system, that they were able to have the wealth to build the biggest navy the world had ever seen. And as a result, you had what was known as Pax Britannica. So this is the period throughout most of the 19th century and up until the outbreak of World War One, where the British Empire is the most powerful country on earth. Britain itself produced more economic output than any other country, more than India, more than China, etc. As a result of this, it meant that it could impose its values onto the rest of the world. And in the middle of the 19th century, you had people like David Ricardo and many other economists, arguing for free trade, because having a system of mercantilism, of protectionism, of having taxes on imports, known as tariffs, of having all these different restrictions, meant that actually goods and services were not able to move across borders as freely, right? There was too many restrictions, the cost of these things were going up, etc. As a result of this, by imposing free trade on these countries, right, it meant that actually you started to have what we now know as the first era of globalization, whereby it doesn't matter where you're buying or selling goods from, whether you're the French Empire or the British Empire or the Germans or the Chinese, etc. People can get products, people can get the raw materials, people can get all the things that they need, and it can be delivered to your door wherever you are in the world. So when we think about it, it's like this is like the first inklings of like the world that we know today, where I can order something from China and it comes here, and I can sell things to China, and and like the whole world is now interconnected, and this is as a result of this capitalist system. Now, around this time of the Industrial Revolution, which again began in Britain because of these conditions here, you end up having a situation where a lot of people were reaping the overall benefits of capitalism and living in a capitalist society, but couldn't see where this wealth was coming from, and instead focused very much on the downside of capitalism. People living in the major cities, in particular those living in like the middle classes, would be able to see from their houses very poor people living in cramped slum conditions and working in factories for long hours at very like kind of low pay relatively. People in those days, if you read anything from like Charles Dickens, for instance, there was this view of like capitalism is evil, like it's ruining the environment, it's ruining people's health, it's making people like poor, and it's making people desperate, and make people live in horrible living conditions, etc., etc. While all of this is true, and while in today's society, in today's world, we see slums and we see sweatshops and we see all these things around, like in particular the third world, it's quite easy to have this idea of this exploitative capitalist, right? And this person who's only looking out for profit, and he's going to do whatever it is just to make as much money as possible, and like damn be everyone else. This kind of caricature is not entirely wrong in the sense of there are some people who are a bit like that. At the same time, what Adam Smith kind of pointed out in the sense of each individual person pursuing their own thing, as long as people are not forcing other people to do things, yeah. As long as you're not as long as you don't have a metaphorical or physical gun to someone's head, people are free to go with like whoever's going to pay them the most and whoever's going to sell them the things for the cheapest cost. What people in the major cities fail to recognise is that actually, where did all these people come from? Because with industrialisation, you had an explosion of urbanisation. So what people kind of fail to recognise is that in the countryside, most people were even worse off. People in dire conditions, right? And so people fled the countryside in order to come to the city for a better life, and they got a better life. They got higher wages. They had less shorter working hours, because you think about actually being a farmer, being a tenant farmer, you're literally from sun up to sun down, you're working non-stop, right? And you're getting very little in reward for it, and the prices of your product go up and down, because there's obviously so many people who are farmers, right? And you're not going to be able to compete with someone who's more productive. During this time, you also had the agricultural revolution. So if you were a wealthy landowner, you could get the equivalent of like a tractor in those days. Wasn't exactly that, right? But you could, through more efficient farming methods, you'd be able to outcompete all the other people right around you, and so you buy up more land from them as they go out of business. People in the countryside end up being very, very poor and didn't really have much alternative. That's why they went to the cities in the first place, right? Because there was all these opportunities, and through working hard and through being thrifty and saving money, etc., they could set up their own businesses, they could set up their own shops, they could set up their own market stalls, and that's how they would grow, right? If you think about companies such as Marks and Spencer's, so companies such as Tesco's, like Sainsbury's, these are clear kind of British examples. You can see that during this period, people who went from being just street sellers and stall sellers, these people ended up setting up their own businesses. You see this in Britain, you see this in America, you see people who had almost nothing all of a sudden becoming multi-millionaires, multi-billionaires. By the turn of the last century, you are at a point now where you're starting to see people who a generation before, or even at the time of their birth, would have been incredibly poor. So before capitalism, your class was incredibly important. The class you were born into was by and large the class that you would die in, right? And that was that, and it was very static, and people's best talents and their creativity and their intelligence and everything else, right, wasn't really upheld to anything, right? For instance, you have people like Mozart, who, despite playing at European courts, for kings and emperors and stuff, still end up being buried in a pauper's grave, because no matter what his talent was, it wasn't he wasn't going to be paid enough in that sort of system to garner the kind of wealth that a celebrity would be getting today. Capitalism with consumer culture, right? With people having having the money to be like, oh, I want to buy like this, yeah, I want to pay for this, I want to pay for concert tickets, I want to pay for a bit of artwork, I want to, etc., etc. All of a sudden, the creativity, the ingenuity, the entrepreneurialism, yeah, the risk-taking elements of society were now had the means by which they could actually go out there, right? The market was unleashed, right? People were free to do whatever they wanted, so long as obviously they didn't hurt other people. And as a result, the wealth of the nation increased. So it wasn't as a result of it wasn't as a result of colonialism, because as we can see, Britain at the turn of the last century had the most colonies on Earth, right? It had a quarter of the world's land surface, had a quarter of the world's population. So one would think that they would still be the richest country on Earth. Instead, in the same period, America, which only very, very recently at that point had taken some colonies from the last remnants of the Spanish empires, so almost no real colonies to speak of, they end up overtaking Britain. And Germany, which in total had 5 colonies around the whole world, most of which were completely inconsequential, like no disrespect to those countries now, right? But they weren't the equivalent of like South Africa, they weren't the equivalent of India, they weren't the equivalent of Australia or Canada, right? And yet, Germany also overtook Britain. Considering that Germany had only unified 30 years before that, it's quite incredible to think that actually Germany, which had previously been all these different city-states and different kingdoms and duchies, etc., etc. Now that it was all unified, now that you didn't have all this protectionism and all these barriers to trade and people going from one place to the next being able to sell things, yeah. Now that all that system was completely got rid of, now all of a sudden, industrialists in Berlin could trade with people in Frankfurt, right? And so you have this huge market now, right, for goods and services to be sold. And as a result, Germany very quickly industrialized and was able to sell different things, right? Same thing with America. The different competing states, where different states have different tax policies, etc., and different attitudes to labor policies and all this kind of stuff, yeah, meant that different states could compete with each other. And this is what we see even today. Tax rates in California are much higher than they are in Texas or in Nevada. And so as a result, different states are competing with each other for these different things. Another country which is very wealthy like this, Switzerland. Again, this competition, this decentralization of different states, within a country, meaning that different cantons are able to have different tax rates. And so as a result, they're all competing with each other for who can be most attractive to business, or if they want to go in the opposite direction, then they can go in the opposite of that direction. But it means that businesses are free to up and leave if they so choose. And as a result of this, we end up having, globalization. We have people going, I could have a factory here in Britain where I'd have to pay workers a much higher rate, or I could close that factory down, set one up in China where I have to pay people much less, and it will be cheaper for me to do that and to ship the things back to Britain than it would to do it the other way. And who benefits from that? The consumer benefits. Standards of living in the Western world over the last 200 years have shot up tremendously, right? And every country which has had capitalism has seen huge rates of increases of wealth. We've seen poverty rates in absolute terms and in real terms plummet. We've seen 1 billion people being lifted out of poverty in the last 20 or 30 years, right? We've seen across the world, right? Every country which has got rid of restrictive systems, has got rid of government controlled systems and stuff, yeah. Every country which has freed up the marketplace has seen this explosion of great wealth and prosperity, in which the vast majority of people are lifted out of poverty, right? So it's not just the very, very rich people, it's also the middle class, it's also the working class, it's also even the poorest people. The poorest people in today's society, here in the industrialized world, live better lives than kings and queens from 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, right? Because of this explosion of wealth. There's more food in the shops, yeah. There's more access to technology, even things like toilets, right? Like sanitation, everything, right? Everything is so much better in the last 200 or so years as a result of this explosion of industrialization and this explosion of entrepreneurialism and different companies competing with each other in terms of having a market to sell to customers and for customers to be able to purchase things, the best quality things at the cheapest prices, right? And so the consumer benefit, the capitalist like benefit, and while this constant competition means that occasionally some people lose out, some people might lose their job, a factory might shut down here. By and large, overall, it benefits it benefits the wider society. Capitalism is not a perfect system, and I think to change the quote of Winston Churchill when he was talking about democracy, he said that democracy was the worst form of government except all others which have been tried from time to time. And I think we can kind of say the same about capitalism.